Right, good afternoon everybody. It's now 12 o'clock and I'd like to welcome you to today's Unlimited webinar on legal structures made simple-ish. So in a couple of minutes I'm going to hand over to Adrian Ashton, who will be delivering today's webinar. As ever, we're recording the webinar so we can send that out to you afterwards, and any notes or questions that you have we can hopefully answer during the session. And if you want to type those into the question box, we can spend a good 10 minutes at the end doing a bit of a Q&A. So today's webinar is going to be a bit of a double act because due to internet technology, I will be controlling the slides as Adrian speaks. We're in completely different locations. So hope this works well, and thanks for bearing with us, and I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. So I'm going to now hand over. The next voice you're going to hear is Adrian. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie, and hello everyone. Thank you for giving up your Friday lunchtimes. On what, from where I'm sitting, looks like a very nice, enjoyable sunny afternoon. So hopefully you're sitting near a window so you can enjoy it. If not, hopefully the next hour or so will pass quickly enough that you won't feel too cheated and you'll still get the chance to go out and enjoy some of it. I have to also begin by elaborating on the point Julie made about us doing a double act. I live in a small market town called Todmorden, which is in a rural valley. When we experimented earlier this week, we found that the internet infrastructure of the valley can't cope with me speaking and sharing a screen with you all at the same time. We've also just discovered about 10 minutes ago that the internet infrastructure can't cope if I talk at a rate faster than this at any one time. So I'm afraid I'm going to sound very dull and boring for the next hour. That's not to say that the subject is dull and boring, and hopefully some of the stories that I can share and issues I can highlight will help you to engage with it a little more easily, and you won't find yourself nodding off. So just by way of introduction, I am a volunteer mentor for Unlimited through their one of their programs. I'm also involved in supporting some of Unlimited's other programs around social entrepreneurs, working with universities and other exciting things. And you can find out more about Unlimited's programs on their website. If you want to find out more about me in general, there's a website with my name on it, with lots of pictures, video clips, pretty pictures, stories. I'm also on Twitter. So if you want to kind of keep up with me after today, or you just want to kind of throw some tweets out at random about how much you're enjoying or not enjoying this session, then feel free to drop that on there as well. But moving on as swiftly as we can into the next slide, what I wanted to do was just to give you all a bit of a structure for this webinar session, because legal forms, legal structures are normally something that are very dull and boring, and that we pay solicitors and lawyers lots of money to talk about in a language that we don't really understand, if we're honest. So what I want to do is give some context why legal forms are important for social entrepreneurs to be thinking about, to be talking about, a framework for how we start to approach legal structures. If you do a quick Google search for social enterprise legal structures, there are lots of books, there are lots of matrices and charts and tables which jump into all the detail of them, and that's not necessarily very useful. So what I want to do is give you all a bit of a framework to think about how you engage with those, how you approach it. What I also want to look at with you as well are the role of the regulators to the different legal structures. Very often entrepreneurs will adopt a legal form, they will take advice, they'll seek options, but nobody will tell them who's watching over them in that legal form, what they need to be aware of, what safeguards that regulator can offer, and what that regulator can do to you if you step out of line. We'll briefly look at the 16 options. That's right, 16, 1-6. There are 16 different legal forms that organisations can adopt in the United Kingdom now. probably only about 15 of those are appropriate for social entrepreneurs. We're not going to go through all of them in great detail. We'll give you a quick overview and a quick around the houses of some of the more common and popular choices. And then we'll also finish up with some pretty pictures and ideas about where I think might be good places for you all to go next if you want to continue exploring this subject and to inform yourselves a little bit more. Okay, but before we go into that, you need to know a bit about me, really, because who is this strange voice we've never heard about before? So in terms of offering you some words of reassurance about myself, and hopefully the slides will catch up as I'm talking. If not, Julie, can you please click somewhere? If not, if it's not clicking forwards, then we'll just keep talking and take some notes as we go. It'll be fine, I'm sure. But some words of hopefully reassurance about me, and I think it's always important, this part. If we're taking advice from anyone about any issue, we need to know what they're saying with it. We need to know what's influenced that person's thoughts about that issue, what have they understood about it, because if we're taking their advice and guidance, we need to know if it's relevant. Have they understood it properly? Can we trust them enough in terms of their experiences? Are they common enough to us? And on that basis, you should never be afraid to disregard advice you're given, as long as you know why you're disregarding it, so to test it. So in terms of helping you to test me, some bits about me, people like Unlimited, very nice people like Unlimited say that I'm very good and knowledgeable about this sort of subject matter, which is quite reassuring. The Community Interest Company form, when that was first launched about 7 or 8 years ago, I did a bit of personal work on my own back in my own name, and we've actually seen some changes to KIC legislation now, largely I think because of what I did in terms of lobbying the regulator over that. I've also done work with various government departments on some of the big national programs about spin-out social enterprises from the Department of Health and other government public services, and a large part of that has been about the structures that those emerging enterprises take. But I don't have a piece of paper like lawyers and solicitors would have, so this next, in terms of what we're going through, it is really there for information and guidance. You know, this is going to be your enterprise, you're signing up to it, not me, so you need to be happy and comfortable with what you're doing with it. Okay, that's enough about me, so let's moving on. Why are legal forms important? Why do we need to talk about them? Legal forms are important for the following reasons. Credibility. Very often certain audiences that we engage with will judge us on what legal form we have as a social enterprise. I know of a social enterprise loan fund, a social enterprise lender, who says that you cannot be a social enterprise if you have shares in your structure, which is at odds with all of the other social enterprise lenders out there. So it affects your ability to attract income. Also in terms of what type of income you want to attract into the future as well. So some legal forms will be easier and more attractive for attracting grant finance. Others, it will be easier to raise community finance, some sort of community share issue. Others, it will be equity stakes as well. Legal forms are also important because as social enterprises, we trade. It's a social enterprise. Social, it exists to fix the world. Enterprise, it does that through trading. Marketplaces change over time. Customer needs change over time. That may mean that we need to be dynamic and responsive in terms of our enterprise and what our legal form will allow us to do in the future. There's also the question of risk, one of the elephants in the room that people very rarely talk about. What if it all goes wrong? Sometimes it does, and we're not very good at talking about social enterprise failure and what happens to people if it all goes horribly wrong. So people have taken a risk in terms of setting up a social enterprise. They may have put their own money in, they may have stood as guarantors to loans. So how do we protect that risk that people have taken through the legal forms? How do we protect our mission? 15, 20, 30 years from now, it will be a different group of people managing and leading our enterprises. We will hopefully have retired to a beautiful tropical island with pina coladas on the beach. but how do we make sure that our original vision isn't lost, isn't subverted? So how do we future-proof things? So those are all the reasons why legal structures are important. So I mentioned that before we would start to look at some of the detail, I'd offer you a framework in terms of some overarching concerns. What do we think about? How do we start to approach these issues and questions? I can see on my screen as well, as we're doing this, that the technology is not only struggling at my end in terms of internet connections, but also at Julie's end as well in terms of flipping in between, but not to worry. Okay, so this is something that I've developed myself. It's called CRAMP, C-R-A-M-P. And what I always say with entrepreneurs, with groups, is if you can work out what you want these 5 things to be in your enterprise, then it's really easy to find a legal form and a governance structure that fits, that you can just adopt and wrap around all of that, because this is what defines you. And I've kind of shortened it to CRAMP, because very often when we're doing something quite strenuous that we don't enjoy, or we haven't maybe had that much practice in before, we can get a cramp. So legal forms, legal structures is the same thing. So CRAMP is there. It's about the credibility. Who do we want to impress? How do we want people to see us? It's about what basis are the relationships on which we work with other people. Who do we answer to, and on what terms, in terms of that issue of accountability? Who keeps us in check? Money. Where does the money come from? Where does it go to? What type of money is involved? And power. Who gets to make the big decisions? Who sits in the big chairs? And on what basis do they get that power? Once you kind of started to explore those issues, finding a legal form is actually really easy afterwards. So always keep that in mind. After this session today, if you go on and read anything else about legal forms, if you look at any of the charts or any of the tables or talk to any advisors or go on any other workshops, always remember that framework, because it's a really good checklist in terms of relating that information to your vision. Okay, so let's go on to the regulators before we look at the different legal forms. I mentioned there are 16 legal options, 15 of which can be used by social enterprises, but there are only 4 regulatory bodies who share more between them. So this is quite important. So let's kind of, I've grouped them together into 2 bunches. Companies House. So Companies House look after all of the companies. So those are companies limited by guarantee, companies limited by shares, PLCs, and also all of the community interest companies. And then we've also got what used to be called the FSA, the Financial Services Authority, and it's now called the Financial Consumer Authority. Government changed that particular regulatory body. And the FCA and the FSA look after industrial and provident societies. And those are usually the historical form which cooperatives adopted, but I'll come to that in a little bit. Okay, but the headlines for these 2 regulators, things you need to know about them. They can't, the first thing and the most important thing, they can't tell you how to run your enterprise. If you decide the best thing to do is to trade in widgets rather than doorknobs, you can do that. You don't need their permission. If you decide you want to open up new shops, you want to trade online, you need to borrow money, whatever it is, it's your enterprise, it's your decision, you run it. They can't get involved in that. What they're concerned about is that you're keeping all your paperwork up to date, so that you're keeping appropriate records and paperwork, that you put all your annual returns and accounts in on time. The biggest reason why most companies are struck off the Companies House register is because they don't put their annual returns in on time. Really simple thing, you only have to do it once a year. So many people forget, and you'll get into trouble for it. So as long as you keep your paperwork up to date, you're fine. If you don't keep your paperwork up to date, or they have reason to believe that there's some dodgy dealings going on in terms of people are using the company for fraudulent purposes, they can investigate. They can come down, knock on the door, go through the tax records, have some discussions, and depending what they find, they can prosecute or sue individual directors in a personal capacity. So, generally speaking, Companies House, the FSA and the FCA, as long as you keep your paperwork up to date, as long as you use common sense, as long as you don't do anything stupid or knowingly stupid, you're probably going to be okay, and they'll let you get on with what you want to do. So they're quite friendly regulators. Okay, the next 2 regulators are the KIC regulator and the Charity Commission. These are quite interesting. both the Community Interest Company Regulator and the Charity Commission can actually get involved in your trading activities. They do have the powers to intervene and say, no, you shouldn't be doing that, and actually stop you from exploring certain marketplaces or trading ventures if they feel that it's not directly related to your founding purposes and you don't have their permission to change it. So that's something to be wary of. It's a useful power in terms of protecting that social mission, stopping it from being subverted in the future, but it does restrict some of the flexibility going forward. Like the other regulators, they want your paperwork kept and up to date. The other things to be mindful of, though, that are a bit unusual for these two regulators, is that if they feel it's appropriate, they can remove and appoint directors, or in the case of charities, trustees, of their own choosing, which is a useful safeguard if you're worried about future directors, future board members going bad, but is something to be mindful of. The other thing to be aware of in terms of the KIC regulator, that the KIC regulator can sue other people in your name. So if you're a community interest company and things start to get a bit messy and the KIC regulator gets involved, if other people owe your KIC money, then the regulator can sue them, even if you feel it's not appropriate. They have the power to overrule you and do that, which again is a useful way of protecting that social purpose, making sure that people don't take you for a ride. But it is unusual in that they're the only regulator out of all four who can do that, who have that power. The other thing to be mindful of with all these regulators is all the regulators have a website. On their websites, they also have lots of published guidance in terms of those powers and when and how they'll use them. The only exception to this is the KIC regulator. So just be mindful of that in terms of if you're taking on or looking at that particular form. Okay, so those are the regulators, the big guns done out of the way. So what legal forms are out there? So hopefully you won't have fallen off your chairs or fallen over when you see the screen in terms of all the options out there. Like I said, I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail. I was going to skim through them really. Companies we'll look at in a few moments. Charities we will look at as well. Partnerships we're not really going to touch upon today, partly because we don't have a lot of time, and partly because within social enterprise land it's very rare to find partnerships being the form that's adopted by social entrepreneurs. Historically, partnerships were formed by two or more people who come together in the common pursuit of profit because they do have a shared activity. So for example, accountants, when they set up their own practice, will need an office, will need a clerk and such like, but those will be too expensive for them to afford on their own. So several accountants will club together, form a partnership and share those costs between themselves. That's a partnership. What we also have now is a limited liability partnership, because in a regular partnership all the partners are equally liable for each other's actions. So if one partner goes bad and runs off with all the money, all the other partners are personally liable. So we now have a new form called the limited liability partnership, which protects that. The trust is a legal form. It's a charitable trust, but charitable trusts can't trade. They exist to administer an asset in perpetuity. So we're not going to look at that. Sole traders are where most social entrepreneurs start out on their journey. And an unincorporated association for those communities who come together to explore and develop social enterprise, that will be where they start out on their journey as well. And societies are reflections of cooperative societies, and we'll come on to those in a moment. So those are there to kind of say there's a lot of them. Take your time, don't feel pressured, and again as a reassurance, because I've met lots of social enterprises who have adopted the legal form, and when I ask them, why did you pick that particular form, they say, because our advisor said that was the form we had to be, because that's the form for social enterprise. And their advisors, their counsel, whatever, didn't make them aware that there were these other options. So always be aware of your options, that you always have a choice. Okay, so let's look into some of these forms in a bit more detail. Okay, cooperatives. Firstly, cooperatives are, in many ways, the originators of the modern social enterprise movement. Cooperatives have been around since time immemorial. The the earliest references that I can find to what we would recognize as a cooperative enterprise are written on Babylonian clay tablets and talk about an agricultural trading cooperative. So they've been around for quite a while. They are defined by a set of values and principles, social values and social principles, which are about people coming together to address injustice in their lives through trading together, so addressing social needs through the marketplace. So actually there's a lot of commonality there with the modern social enterprise movement. The thing that makes them really different, though, the thing that marks them out from other forms of social enterprise, is this issue of democracy. Cooperatives are member-based organizations. They are accountable to their members, and those members will have a shared defining characteristic. In a consumer cooperative, such as the cooperative group, that's the customers. Anyone who is a customer of any cooperative group store can become a member. That's the basis of its cooperative. There are housing cooperatives, and the tenants are the members, people who live there. The housing cooperative exists for the tenants. There are worker cooperatives who are owned by everyone who works in it, and so it goes. That can make it a bit different to lots of different forms of social enterprise. What's also interesting is that cooperatives were the first kind of alternate business model to create their own specialized legal form. So back in the 1850s, the Industrial and Provident Societies Act was passed, which said, if you want to be a cooperative, this is the legal form to have, because that will protect the values and principles and the members' interests over time. What's happened, though, since the 1850s is company law, partnership law has changed quite a lot, and quite a lot more than IPS law. And so what we have now is cooperatives can be incorporated in pretty much any legal form. So there are cooperatives who are structured as partnerships, and there are cooperatives who are structured as companies, and cooperatives who are structured as community interest companies. But they can all evidence those key defining values and principles. But there's a lot of stuff in there. So that's a bit about cooperatives. The next one to look at are companies. Companies are interesting because according to all the surveys that are done on social enterprise land and the sector, companies are the most commonly adopted legal form for social enterprises. And that's usually companies limited by guarantee, although there are other flavors of company. Company law has a lot of flexibility within it, so we can kind of tweak the articles or the rules within it to protect those values. We can do things called an entrenchment. So a company is answerable to its members, so the question becomes, well, how do we protect the assets? How do we protect that vision if Companies House are only concerned with us putting our paperwork in on time? What's to stop some members subverting it? Well, recent changes to Companies Act allow for this clause called entrenchment. And what entrenchment says is any article or any rule that the company adopts which is agreed to be entrenched means that if people want to change it in the future, then 100% all of the members at that time must explicitly agree to the change. It's actually easier to wind a company up in terms of getting agreement and a quorum to wind the company up than it would be to change one of those entrenched articles. So it's a pretty good way of protecting it in terms of flexibility. And we can create them quite simply. We can do them online. We can try our hand with doing it with Companies House. There are other incorporation agents online and on the high street. There are paper forms. We can do it the old-fashioned way, print them off, fill them out, send them back in. And they're pretty straightforward. So they're quite nice. Companies, it's also useful to know that they're the most flexible in terms of future-proofing as well. So my default position, if people say, we need a legal form quickly, what's the best thing to adopt in a hurry? Companies are probably the quickest and easiest and cheapest form to set up, and they're also probably the quickest, easiest and cheapest form to make changes to, or to change into something else at a future date if you find you need to. So that's companies. The next one is the community interest company. This is normally where, if we were all in person, I'd say put your hands up, and in terms of it, have you heard about this? If you have, what do you think you've heard about this? Community interest companies have been around for 7 or 8 years now. They were introduced by the previous government as a way to encourage social entrepreneurs, as a way to give them more recognition in the marketplace and help them to better access finance in terms of equity finance, in terms of as a trading enterprise. They are a bolt-on to an existing company. So in being a community interest company, you are both a company and a community interest company, and that means you report to the two separate regulatory bodies. So it's important to be mindful of. As a kick, there's also legislation that says you must include the letters CIC or the words Community Interest Company in your trading name. And that, or the intention is that gives you a visibility and a branding in your marketplace that allows your customers, your partners, credibility and reassurance that you are a legitimate, quote unquote, legitimate social enterprise. There's also within the kick additional legislation, regulatory legislation, that says the asset lock is there by statutory legislation. It can never be taken out, it can never be moved, and that's quite useful. There is also legislation about the profits and what a kick can do with its profits. So there are caps on how much profit a kick can distribute by gifts to private individuals, or if it has share capital, in terms of how much share dividend it can pay to its investors as well. There's also an additional report it must make every year in terms of what have we done this year to benefit our community, but it's a bit messier with the paperwork. So as well as going through all of the company's house forms, as a kick we also need to go through the kick forms, and because of a slight hiccup when kick legislation was passed, kicks cannot do all of their filing online. So certain kick forms can only be done paper-based, and that's important to be aware of if you are a kick and you're coming to do your annual returns, because Companies House will not accept that you've completed your annual return until all the forms are in. And if you've left it to the last minute and you thought, oh, we'll just upload them all the night before, like most company accountants do, you can't do that. It won't let you upload them. And that means you'll be late filing, and that means you get fined, which has caught a lot of kicks out in previous years, although people are becoming more aware of this and we're kind of getting better. The other thing to mention about kicks, community interest companies, all of those features in there are not unique. We can build asset locks into other legal forms, we can build social purposes into other legal forms, and we can build limits on the distribution of profits into other legal forms. What we can't do as easily is to put those things in statutory legislation. And on that basis, any enterprises who are getting involved in community asset transfer or working with local authorities to take over the leases on large public buildings, that's a very useful reassurance to offer those council officers to kind of say this protects this public asset into the future because it's statutory legislation. So that's a useful one to be aware of there. And then the third slide to talk about are charities, because this is the other legal form that a lot of social enterprises adopt. A lot of social entrepreneurs don't think of charities as being a legitimate choice, even though charities can actually trade. And if you look at all the stats and the research and the various tables that the Charity Commission produces and the accounts of the larger charities, what we tend to see is that the largest charities in the UK derive a really big chunk of their income from commercial trading, which is often a big surprise to people. Charities, though, there is a big difference in terms of a charity form from any of the other legal forms, because charities are based on the assumption that they exist to do a good thing rather than do an economic thing. The two are seen as being very separate in the legislation that underpins them, or the assumptions within it. A social enterprise does good things through trading. Company law recognises that and allows for it. Industrial and Provident Society, or community benefits and cooperative societies as they're becoming known, recognises that and allows for it, but charities it's not quite, it's a bit clunkier. And as a result they can have a very paternalistic culture, and that's recognised through their governance, because the governing body of a charity, its board of trustees, should not have any material stake or any material benefit from the activities of the charity. Put simply, that means a charity trustee should not really be on the payroll. In all the other legal forms that we've looked at briefly, that's fine. Cooperatives, companies, community interest companies, we can be a director on the board, we can be employed, that's fine. Within a charity, it's really not something that we should be doing. And that means as the entrepreneur, we're going to have to sort of give up control, overarching control of our vision of our baby to a group of other people who may decide that they don't think we're the right person for the job and therefore ask us to leave. And because they're the governing body, they have the power to do that. So there's something to be aware of there in terms of working it out though. But the nice thing about charities, they've been around for a long time. Generally speaking, people trust them, they like them. They can be a useful way to access certain tax breaks. So as a charity, if you have trading premises on the high street or you're taking on commercial premises, charities are eligible for 80% rate relief. Other types of organisation are eligible for discretionary rate relief, so you kind of have to put the application in, it can only go up to 20%. And in terms of applying for grants as well, there are lots of grant making bodies who say you can only apply for our money if you have a charity number. But there are also lots of grant making bodies who don't care what your charity number is or isn't. They're just concerned about what activity are you going to be delivering and who are you going to be benefiting. So if you're a company limited by guarantee, that's fine. I also know of companies limited by shares who've got certain features written into their articles, and they've been able to attract grant finance as well. So it's not a make or break, that aspect. But in terms of pursuing this issue of charitable status, it's all online now. Go to the Charity Commission's website and it will take you through the forms. Who are the people involved? What are your purposes? What are your activities? Do you have more than £5,000 a year of income at the moment? If you don't, when are you going to get it? And what's your bank account details and such like. So we need to have a bit of the basic structure first to begin with. So that's charities, and those are the big three really. And the reason I say they're the big three is because cooperatives can be incorporated in lots of different legal forms, but companies, community interest companies and charities are the big ones, are the big three. So if you look at any of the sector surveying and mapping, so for example Social Enterprise UK does some sector mapping every other year. On the next slide I've just lifted a chart from that table, as you can sort of see there, and it kind of goes down. It says, well, what are the most popular forms in terms of social enterprise land? What are people taking on? Companies limited by guarantee, they're up there at the top, more than half. Industrial and provident societies, not as well represented because we're seeing a growth in community interest companies, but we're also seeing a bit of share. A company limited by share there as well. Partnerships again and others much down the list. But again, it kind of sets out, you know, these are the popular forms. If they're popular for a reason. People are obviously finding that these are the best forms to allow them to do what they want to do. The Industrial and Provident Society form as well, there are more industrial and provident societies than there are community interest companies, partly because they've been around for so much longer, but also because through an industrial and provident society, it's much easier to raise finance from the community through a mechanism called a community share issue. And usually that community share issue can also apply for what's called investment, the enterprise investment scheme. So people buying that investment in the enterprise can get a tax relief on it personally, which is wonderful. And there's a lot of sort of interesting stuff going on there at the moment. As an industrial and provident society, we can also do that community share issue without having to go through as much bureaucracy and process and cost as a company would. So again, they're very useful forms for very particular different purposes, which is why, going back to that idea of the cramp, what's the money flow going to be about? What's the accountability about? Who do we want to be answering to? Where's the money going to come from? And if we want to be answerable and led by the wider community, and if we want to mobilize and harness the economic potential and investment from the community, industrial and provident societies may well be the best form to allow us to do that. But of course, it's not just Social Enterprise UK. who do this mapping on the sector. The NCVO, who some people may have heard of, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, also do a mapping of kind of third sector legal forms and structures, and they do that through what's called their almanac. So every year, this comes out every year, and again, so on the next slide, I've lifted that sort of page from it. So 2012, they kind of mapped out and said, within the third sector, what are the different forms? What are the different legal structures that they're adopting? And it's quite nice because what it also does here is it sets this out on the basis of, is it trading? Is it formal? Is it largely involved by the public? Is the public sector have a large stake in it? Is it much more community-led? And how do those governance types, how do those legal types start to map out against those issues, which again goes back to the cramp. What are we trading on? Who do we answer to? Where does the money come from? And so things like this, maps like this, research like this, can help us reflect on some of those questions to see how others are doing it. And then we can go and talk to them and ask them, how have you found that legal form? And don't be afraid to ask questions. Okay, last few slides, just to kind of sum up and give you some ideas for what you might want to do next. I mentioned at the outset, I wanted to give you some suggestions, some jumping off points, so that if you have been interested by what we've been discussing today and what I've mentioned, and you want to explore this further, you want to kind of, where do I go next? Where's the next best thing for me to go, to look at, to read, to do? There are two things that I want to suggest. One is this website that you can see here on your screen now, called Get Legal, getlegal.org.uk. This is quite a nice tool, I find, because it's based on a toolkit which was developed by the cooperative sector back in the 1980s, 1990s, called Select a Structure. And what it's done is it's taken this toolkit and it's put it online. So you give this website your email address, and then you can access the tool. And the tool is really fun because it's a multiple choice questionnaire, and it takes you through those questions which say, what about pre-start? What are you thinking about? What's your thinking around your enterprise at pre-start? What's your thinking around your enterprise as it grows? What's your thinking around the enterprise with what it does with the employees, with money, with profits? What's your thinking about where investment comes from? And what you're thinking about, what happens if it's wound up in the future? Social enterprises are created to fix a social need. Once that need's been fixed, do we want to keep carrying on and reinvent ourselves, or do we wind it up, have a big celebration, and go our separate ways with more enthusiasm and enjoyment onto the next set of adventures? So Get Legal is a really good way of starting to test some of your ideas and to ask questions of yourselves in direct, applied, practical ways. Now, depending when you, as with any tool, depending what mood you're in, what time of day it is, who you've just spoken with, will determine how you answer these questions. And every time you do it, it will probably come out slightly different, but that's fine because it helps you start to explore some of the options and scenarios. And then the other thing that I would suggest it's worth getting your hands on, which is another tool, again, it's come from Cooperatives UK, and it's called Simply Legal. Now, Simply Legal is one of a number of guides that Cooperatives UK have created, and these aren't applicable just to cooperatives, but to wider community and social enterprises. And you can get all of them from their website, which is uk.coop/simply-series. So uk.coop/simply-series, or if you do a quick Google search for Simply Legal, Cooperatives UK, it will probably take you to the page as well. Now this I find is a really good manual almost, because at the moment it's the best material I've come across which explains all of the different legal forms in plain English, with case studies, with pros and cons. So as you start to think, well, this might be a good legal form, or we've narrowed down the choices, this is a good way to dig into those choices in a bit more detail and helping you understand the implications and what they might mean, and just to kind of test that your understanding of them. So that's a really good guide. It's downloadable for free. It's a PDF document. It's a really big PDF document in terms of the numbers of pages, so please don't be scared when you download it and you open it and it says page 1 of however many. Flick through it, just jump to the pages you need rather than reading the whole thing at bedtime one night, unless you really can't sleep, in which case it's a really good way to get you off. So that kind of takes you through some of my best places, what I think are the useful places to go next. Having thought about legal structures generally, what are the most popular options, and where do we go from there? And what do you do next? How do you find out more about all of these options, and how do you start to work out which might be the right ones for you? There is one last thing I would suggest though to everyone about legal structures, in terms of my last slide. And this is, I always like to leave people with the key message. And the last slide that I've got in the slides we've got here kind of sum that up. And this is the one thing that you should all remember if you remember nothing else. And that's what it is there. Never pick your legal form on the basis. Oh, sorry, I'm back again. Never pick your legal form on the basis of what someone else says that's what you should be. It's your legal form. It's your enterprise. You're responsible for it. So you need to know and be confident for using. And if you're not, then you're in trouble, because you may find that you're acting illegally without realizing it, and that can cause problems for you personally, for your community, and for your purpose as a social enterprise. So thank you for bearing with us over the last 40 minutes or so. Thank you for bearing with us as well as we've juggled the technology between us. Hopefully you've all found something useful there, something interesting, maybe something you didn't know before, or just been reassured by something that you thought you already knew, and actually, yeah, that is good sound understanding that I have now, and I feel more confident in it, which is great. As Julie said on the outset, we structure these webinars to last for about an hour, so we've got about 10-15 minutes now. If people would like to put any specific queries or questions to us, and I'll see if I can have a stab at offering you some initial responses to see where we go from there. So start typing away. Julie, I suspect, is about to come back on the line to field those questions, and we'll see where we go from there. But in the meantime, thank you for your participation today.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That was very, very good, very informative. We've already had one message come through saying that today has reaffirmed what legal structure somebody should adopt. So one person's found it useful, which is fantastic. As Adrian said, if people want to type in any questions, we can start answering those in a few minutes. So I'll just give people a few minutes to type them in the questions box. Whilst I'm waiting for you to do that, I'd like to remind you that our next webinar in this series, and we've got a number of webinars coming up between now and Christmas on a variety of different topics. So our next webinar is in a couple of weeks. It's on Tuesday, the 24th of September, 12 o'clock again, and that is going to be on the subject of sustainability, and a very popular subject that is with people starting out. That's going to be delivered by Benedict Foyt, if anybody knows him. He ran a webinar just before the summer as well. So hopefully if you can sign into that, that would be great. So here's the first question that's come through. Can you tell us anything, Adrian, about CIO? Is it CIOs?
Okay, yes, thank you for the prompt. I knew there was something I was going to pick up in the slides. This is the nice thing about doing these webinars every year, because the legislation changes every year as well. So charities, it used to be a case that most social enterprises who wanted to incorporate as a charity set up as a dual status. They set up as a charity and a company limited by guarantee. And that's because as a charity form in itself does not offer any limited liability or any personal protection to its trustees or members. So if it all goes horribly wrong in the charity, then the people involved are personally at risk. As a company, they're called limited companies because it limits your personal guarantee. It limits your personal risk. So what has happened historically is a company limited by guarantee would be formed, and then that company would gain charitable status and get the best of both worlds. What's happened in the last year or so is that there's been the introduction of the CIO, which is the Charitable Incorporated Organization, which is a bit of a mouthful. And the premise of the CIO is that it gives you all the benefit of being a charity and all the benefit of being a company limited by guarantee, but only in registering once with the Charity Commission. So you would go to the Charity Commission as the regulatory body, you would apply to register as a CIO, a charitable incorporated organisation, and if and when that's approved, you'd be a charity, but you'd also have the benefits of limited liability, so you'd be protecting the personal risk of individuals without all of the hassle of also having to be a company at the same time.
Great, thanks Adrian. We have quite a few questions coming through now, which is fantastic, and quite a lot of people saying thank you, this has been a really excellent presentation, so I just wanted to point that out. We've also had lots of people saying, please can we have the slides, please can we have the slides, and of course you can have the slides. What will happen is this afternoon, after we finish the webinar, I've got everybody's email address because you've registered on this webinar, so I will be able to send you the slides later, and once we've uploaded the recording onto YouTube, this will be accessible. I can send that to you. It'll also be accessible on the Unlimited website. That might take a few days, but you can certainly have the slides today. So another question is, what's an asset lock?
Okay, an asset lock, and maybe this is an interesting, this kind of picks up on the defining features of a social enterprise, and it's maybe a useful point just to backtrack slightly. There are lots of different legal forms, as we've seen, that social enterprises can be incorporated within and can adopt. That's because social enterprises have no overarching legal definition in this country. There is no single legal form that they must adopt. What happens is that they are identified by having three particular characteristics. Number one is that they trade to achieve a social good. And number two is that there is a restriction on the amount of profits that they can distribute to private individuals. And number three is that there is an asset lock. Now the asset lock is this idea that a social enterprise is born, it trades, it prospers on the basis that it's achieving a social mission. It gains contracts, it gains material goods in pursuit of that social mission. So as it grows up over time, it will acquire computers, it may acquire vehicles, helicopters, luxury penthouses, villas, all that shebang. Now, all of those things have been gained to help it better pursue its social purpose. And if it's wound up at a future date, those assets should be locked or protected against that social purpose. So an asset lock says if the enterprise is wound up or dissolved or ceases trading at a future date, any remaining assets, any stuff that it's still got left over, has to be given back to its community or passed on to another social enterprise to keep using it for community benefits.
Great.
Hopefully that helps to clarify.
Thank you very much. A few more questions coming through, but a couple of people have asked, can we just have a reminder of the web address for the Simply Legal PDF again, please? Okay.
Yes, it's www.uk.coop, that's uk.coop, Cooperatives UK's website, and then / all one word, Simply Series, SIMPLYSERIES, Simply Series.
Right, and I'll send that link.
Struggling to track it down. Yep, send that link through as well.
I'll send the link through with the slides. People have got that. So somebody's asked a question: are there any limitations about setting up a business for overseas students, as it seems there are for liability insurance? And I don't know if you know much about what can apply to overseas students, but I'll just throw that question in there, Adrian.
Okay, so I'm going to make some assumptions about that question, which is we're thinking about a social enterprise whose purpose will be to involve and support overseas students in this country. Any legal form is fine to do that, because it's about the way we structure that and to deliver the services. So go back to that CRAMP framework. The insurance question is a really important one and a key issue. Your insurance policy, the amount of money you will be charged for your insurance, will not be determined by your legal structure. It will be determined by the relative risk of your venture and its services and its activities and the people it engages with. It's worth shopping around for insurance. My experience with price comparison websites is that you can end up paying 3 or 4 times more for commercial insurance than you would if you went direct to an insurance provider. I would suggest, in terms of the insurance aspect, have a chat with other entrepreneurs, social enterprises who are involved in comparable activities and services, and just ask them. You'll be amazed at how freely people will be willing to share their experiences, their contacts, just for the asking.
Great, and that's just a good reminder that we do have an online forum in LinkedIn called Ask an Unlimited Mentor. If you've got particular questions you want to share with peers, and you might be able to get some help and advice via that platform as well. Great. Another question which has come through is around directors acting as trustees for charities, and what circumstances does that happen?
Okay. So if I go back to the early point about the CIO, the Charitable Incorporated Organization. In a Charitable Incorporated Organization, the top governing body, the board, are trustees, and they're called trustees in charity law. That's fine. If we have a social enterprise which is structured as a charity with company status, which is sometimes called charitable companies, so they predate the introduction of the CIO, and they've decided for whatever reason not to change their status into the new one, then they are both a company and a trustee. And in law, that means that people who sit on that board are both directors, the company directors, and charitable trustees at the same time. And it's important to be mindful of this, because some people may think, oh, we signed up as a director but not as a trustee, so we're just a director and not a trustee, or vice versa. In the eyes of the law, as soon as you become one, you are automatically the other as well, because it's a dual status organization. The director is automatically a trustee, and the trustee is automatically a director. You can't be one and not the other in a charitable company. And it's important to be mindful of that and to explore and make sure that people on that board understand their legal responsibilities and their legal rights as well, because there is some bits of variance between being a company director and being a charity trustee, and what the regulators require and expect of you in those roles. And maybe that's a webinar for another time about legal roles and responsibilities. It's something which I've got about 3 or 4 days worth of training materials on, but it's far too much to bore you with now, especially when it's still a bit sunny, and we're coming up to 1 o'clock, and everybody's probably thinking it's time to go and get my lunch or to nip off home early.
I think you might have volunteered yourself for a webinar in the 2014 series there, Adrian. We'll try and get through a couple more questions before we get to 1 o'clock. Somebody's asked, they've just formed a partnership and they're looking at getting insurance. Do they need employers' liability insurance or just public liability insurance? There's only 2 of them. They don't have any employees.
Okay. Employee liability insurance only kicks in, is a mandatory requirement only if you have employees. So if the partnership is not employing anyone directly, it does not need employee liability insurance legally. However, and there's always a but in these sorts of answers, check with your insurance providers, just to clarify that. Check with whoever helped you set that partnership up, because of the way in which the partners engage with the partnership, there may be some quirky bits in there. And depending if you are pursuing contracts, if you're bidding for tenders through public service bodies, local authorities and such like, they sometimes will have a stipulation that says you must hold employers' liability insurance, even though you don't need to. If you don't have that policy, then they will automatically fail you, which is a bit of a weird part of procurement rules. But that's, again, drifting into procurement rules and regs and procedures and approaches now, and that's another webinar for another time.
Okay, there's at least one more question here, so we'll just go with this one. Is there a definite amount of the profit which should be reinvested to fulfill the social aims and objectives of the venture? It
depends. It depends. any venture, any social enterprise should be aiming to make a profit. If it's not aiming to make a profit, then it's aiming to make a loss by default. So profit's good. Even if you don't make a profit, that's fine, just keep aiming for it. And it varies incredibly as to what social enterprises do and have in terms of that profit distribution. The legal form you adopt may also stipulate within statutory legislation how much you can move around as well. And there are also other considerations, for example, the social enterprise mark, which is a quality assurance mark that some social enterprises are pursuing, which says if you want to be recognized as fulfilling the criteria for having this kind of quality management system, it's called the social enterprise mark, then at least 51% of your profits must be retained. So you can't distribute more than 49% of your profit to private individuals. I'd always take that as a good rule of thumb. It may vary from time to time. It may simply be that within the legal form you adopt and that you set up, you choose a different level, and it may simply be that within the articles, if it's a company, you write a rule that says all of the profits are protected for the purpose, they're reinvested or they're given to the community. If it's a charity, charity law says that's the default position. You can't distribute profits to private individuals. So a bit of a vague answer, I'm afraid, sorry.
No, that's fine, thank you. Just back to the previous question about insurance and public liability insurance. The person who asked that has just come back and said, what about professional indemnity insurance?
Okay, professional indemnity insurance, this equates to, is also known as sometimes as product liability insurance. The idea being that if it's, so for example, if I use product liability insurance as the example, if I run a factory that makes pens and you buy my pen, and despite all of my best efforts, despite all of my quality controls and checkings and procedures, you buy my pen and you put it in your pocket and that pen leaks. Because sometimes, you know, bad stuff happens despite our best efforts and control systems. Product liability says that if you sue me for the cost of your trousers or your blouse or whatever's been ruined by my leaky pen, that product liability insurance policy will cover the cost because I can show I took all reasonable steps and precautions. A professional indemnity policy is the equivalent of that, but in terms of a service. So if I'm delivering a service under contract and something goes horribly wrong, then a professional indemnity or professional liability policy will pay out any damages that are awarded. Which can be shown despite my best efforts and control mechanisms. Professional indemnity, professional liability insurance policies are usually a prerequisite of any tender that you enter. So if you're applying for any contract, to deliver any public contract, that commissioning body will expect you to have a policy, a standard. It's also the sort of policy, though, that you would never expect to have to make a claim on, bizarrely. Because if you do, it shows that something's gone wrong in how you manage your enterprise in a very big way. And on that basis, I also don't know of any companies who've ever had to make a claim or tried to make a claim against their professional indemnity policy. So it's there as a reassurance, it's there as a safeguard, and it's there to help with your credibility with certain customers. Hopefully that helps to answer and clarify.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, I think we've managed to answer all the questions, a bit of a whirlwind Q&A there. So thank you, everybody, for the questions and also the great comments. I think this webinar has been very well received, so that's great feedback and great to hear that it's been helpful. So like I said, I will send out the slides later on this afternoon, and the recording will be shared in the next week or so. And hope you can join the next webinar on the 24th of September on sustainability. Again, I'll send the links for that. So this just leaves me to say huge thanks to Adrian. Thank you very much, and I think you've already booked yourself a slot for the 2014 series. And a couple of people have echoed that. So thanks everybody else. Wishing everybody a good rest of their day for Friday the 13th, and also a great weekend. Enjoy the sunshine. So I'm going to switch off and we're going to end here, but thank you very much, and yes, enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks, Adrian. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.